recording on, then.
Friends, the universe is one gigantic process. We may say that it is a process of becoming, a process of attaining new and ever new levels of existence and of organization. In other words, the universe is an evolution. And in this process, in this evolution, man too is included. Man too evolves. We may say that man has evolved. We can say that man will evolve, or rather, that he can evolve if he makes the effort. Biologically speaking, man has evolved from lower, simpler forms of life. Anthropologically speaking, he has evolved from savagery and barbarism to civilization and culture. While psychologically, he has evolved from unconsciousness to what we term simple consciousness, and from simple consciousness to the rudiments at least of what we term self-consciousness. By simple conscious we mean bare perceptual awareness. That is to say, awareness of sensations experienced through the sense organs as a result of contact with the external world. By self-consciousness we mean that one not only experiences sensations, experiences feelings, emotions, thoughts, volitions and so on, but is also, above that, conscious of oneself as experiencing them. Now this whole process, this process of human evolution, biological, anthropological, psychological, all this has taken many, many millions of years. And altogether, taking it as one process, it constitutes what we call the lower evolution. And this part of the process, we know, is collective. The future evolution of man will be mainly, if not exclusively, psychological and spiritual. We say future, but the process has in fact already begun. The higher evolution, at least to some extent, perhaps even a considerable extent, has been achieved by a few outstanding figures of the past. For instance, by founders of religions, by great artistic geniuses and so on. But we have to pass from a rudimentary self-consciousness to perfect self-consciousness, so far as the majority still is concerned. We may say to pass from self-consciousness also to at least the beginnings of transcendental consciousness. And these are the immediate goals. Eventually, we have to pass from transcendental consciousness to absolute consciousness, or, as we also call it, universal consciousness. And this, we have to emphasize, can be done within the limits of a single human lifetime. This constitutes the higher evolution of man. And this part of the evolutionary process is an individual affair. Nature, as it were, carries us a very long way. Nature carries us for millions of years, carries us up to the very limits of the lower evolution, endows us with the rudiments of self-consciousness, and then nature leaves us on our own. words, our progress depends on our own individual conscious effort. Not that any of us have to make this effort. We are free to make it or not to make it, just as we choose. And the majority, of course, do not choose to make it at all. The majority, perhaps we can say, are not even aware of the possibility of choice. The effort is made by the minority. The effort is made by the few. Some of you may have heard the name of that famous Indian text. It's a Hindu text called the Bhagavad Gita. Some of you may even have read it. And in the Bhagavad Gita there is a verse where Sri Krishna is represented as saying, speaking as the embodiment here of absolute consciousness, is represented as saying that out of 1,000 men, out of 1,000 human beings, only one, he says, seeks me. That is, seeks truth, seeks absolute consciousness. And he also goes on to say that out of 1,000 that seek, one perhaps finds. So this gives us 1 in a million of human beings who seeks and who finds. And if we think over it, we probably conclude that this is perhaps a rather generous estimate, 1 in a million. It illustrates, we may say, this verse illustrates the difficulty of the whole process of the higher evolution. And then in the Dhammapada, there's another verse, a verse attributed to the Buddha, where the Buddha says, it is difficult to attain the human state. Mortal life itself is difficult. It is difficult to hear the real truth. The arising of an enlightened one, that is to say, one who has realized absolute consciousness, is difficult. This is what the Buddha says in the Dhammapada. And we can even paraphrase that in more contemporary language, more in the terminology of these talks, these lectures. And we could say, it is difficult really to be a human being. Really and truly to be a human being. It is difficult to develop self-consciousness. It is still more difficult to develop transcendental consciousness. It is difficult to be an individual. It is difficult to go on making an effort. It is difficult not to sink back into unawareness and to stagnate. All this is difficult. But difficult as it is, we should not allow ourselves to be discouraged. So long as we realize, so long as we really see that the whole process of the higher evolution, the whole process of passing from simple consciousness to self-consciousness, self-consciousness to transcendental consciousness, and so on, so long as we realize that this whole process is difficult, so long as we see it as difficult, and take that difficulty seriously, then there's some hope of success. The danger, we may say, lies in thinking that it's all easy, or at least that it is not very difficult. Now, the whole process of what we call the higher evolution is difficult, partly because as we try to develop self-consciousness and transcendental consciousness, various problems arise. Problems we have not perhaps anticipated. We might have anticipated some problems, might even have had some idea of what they were likely to be, but that's all before we actually embarked on this process of the higher evolution. Once we make a start, once we really try to develop self-consciousness, to be aware, to be mindful, to get a glimpse of the transcendental consciousness, then all sorts of difficulties, all sorts of problems arise, which are totally unexpected. And though we might have read quite widely beforehand, our reading does not give us any help in the solution of these difficulties and the solution of these problems. Incidentally, I say difficulty and I also say problem. By problem, I mean a difficulty that can be solved or rather resolved only by rising to a higher level of being and consciousness. It cannot be solved on its own level. If it can be solved on its own level by a little tinkering here or a little adjustment there, then we call it just a difficulty. For example, our immediate goal is the development of perfect self-consciousness, development of awareness. But we may well find a problem arising in connection with awareness itself. We may even develop the wrong kind of awareness. We may develop what I've termed alienated awareness. By alienated awareness we mean a state of awareness in which we are aware of ourselves without actually experiencing ourselves, especially without experiencing our feelings and our emotions. And we fail to experience ourselves fully, perfectly, for a variety of reasons. Partly is due to the very nature of the times in which we live. We live in an age of transition, an age in which values are constantly changing, in which there are no stable, universally accepted values to which we can adhere, upon which we can base our lives, in accordance with which we can order our actions. So this means that our sense of identity tends to be weakened. There are also other factors. When we are young, we're conditioned into refusing to accept bodily sensations, especially sensations connected with sex. And in the same way, we're conditioned into repressing negative emotions. And we're also taught, again, especially when we're young, that we feel what in fact we do not feel because that's what we ought to feel, and that we do not feel what actually we feel because it's wrong for us to feel that particular way. And for all these reasons, we end up unable, even unwilling, to experience ourselves, and therefore develop alienated awareness. And this already deplorable situation is sometimes aggravated by our wrong understanding of Eastern spiritual teachings, of teachings, for example, which tell you that you have in fact no self, or at least which appear to tell you this, which appear to tell you that the self is an illusion, that it just isn't there. Or by teachings again which tell you that you're not the body, that you're not the feelings, not the emotions, not the mind, that you are in fact God, without body, without parts, without passions. And sometimes the situation is aggravated still further by Eastern teachers without an understanding of the Western mind and its difficulties. True awareness, which we call integrated awareness or integral awareness, is developed by learning, again, to experience ourselves, to experience our physical body, to experience our repressed feelings and emotions, and so on. And there are several ways in which we can do this. And here, as we know, our communication exercises, which some of us will be doing tomorrow and the next day, help very much. Now, all that I've said so far this evening, is familiar ground to most of you, to nearly all of you. It represents the gist of the last two lectures. We're just briefly recapitulating to refresh our minds. Tonight, we come to a problem which is, if anything, even more important, even more crucial than that of alienated awareness. And that is the problem of individuality. Of individuality, true or false. And with this problem, when we come to this problem, when we encounter this problem, we at once find ourselves in the midst of great, not to say dire, confusion. In fact, we find ourselves in the midst of a real hornet's nest. If we're not very careful, we shall certainly be stung. Now this problem, the problem of individuality true or false, arises directly out of the previous problem. That is to say, it arises out of the problem of alienated awareness. And this kind of awareness, alienated awareness, arises, as we've seen, when we do not experience ourselves. When we do not experience ourselves, and when at the same time we are aware of ourselves, or aware of that non-experience, even when we experience, as it were, ourselves not being there. When you do not experience yourself, when I do not experience myself, this is when alienated awareness arises. But here there's another question. Another question arises, which is, when we say that we do not experience ourselves, that you do not experience yourself, that I do not experience myself, what is it that we mean by the self? And once we have asked this question, then others inevitably follow, such as, is the self identical with consciousness? We've spoken much about consciousness, all kinds of consciousness and so on. How are they related to the self? And then, what is the relation between self and individuality? Are they two things, or are they the same thing? Again, what is personality? That's another term that we use. And where does the ego come in? So we find that we're in the midst of the hornet's nest already. Now, these questions are obviously not just semantic questions, not just questions of words, or rather, perhaps I should say instead, they are just semantic questions, but semantic questions happen to be of the greatest practical importance, even in the spiritual life. We've all heard of Confucius. Confucius was once asked by a disciple, what was the first thing to be done, the first thing to be attended to by the man who wanted to reform the state? Apparently in China, in Confucius's day, there were lots of little states, hundreds, even thousands of little states, each under its own little duke or its own little prince. And sometimes these states were in a rather bad way, rather badly administered, even tyrannically administered, and so on. And sages and wise men like Confucius himself used to go about offering advice to these dukes and princes and trying to reform them and to try to reform their states and make them more ideal and more easy to live in for everybody. So this was the question that Confucius was once asked. Supposing someone wants to reform a state, supposing he wants to put everything right, supposing he wants to create ideal conditions, like Plato's Republic or More's Utopia, then what was the very first thing that he should do? What was the first thing that he should attend to? And Confucius answered, the rectification of terms. He didn't say get a big army or raise plenty of money through taxation or anything like that. He didn't even say preach morality and spiritual life. He said the rectification of terms. This comes first. This is the most important. In other words, start calling things by their right names, by their proper names, or start by defining your terms. If you do this, then thought will be clear, orders will be unambiguous, and action will be decisive, and eventually the state will be reformed, or at least there'll be a good chance of its being reformed. Now we are in the position of the man who wanted to reform the state before Confucius gave his advice. The only difference is we want to reform not the state, but ourselves. In other words, we want to develop ourselves, want to cultivate the path of the higher evolution. Confucius, as we know, is no longer around. So, for advice, we have to go to some other quarter. Some of us read books, all sorts of books, books about magic, books about mysticism, philosophy, psychology, psychotherapy, Eastern wisdom, Western thought, and so on. We attend lectures, all sorts of lectures. Every week in a place like London, there are scores and scores of lectures, talk with our friends, discuss with our friends. And we might, if we're very, very interested, even go and visit some visiting Oriental teacher. Or if we're very interested indeed, we may even go abroad, may even go to the East, may even go and visit the teacher in his own special cave in the Himalayas, or his own Zen monastery away in Japan. But then, what happens? What happens at each and every one of these stages, whether it's just reading a book, or a number of books, or going to lectures, or consulting masters, what happens? What happens is that different authorities tell us different things, or even quite opposite things. One says that you should do just one thing. Just ask yourself, who am I? Nothing more than this. Who am I? When you find yourself speaking, say, well, who speaks? When you find yourself listening, say, well, who listens? Who am I? Who am I? Doing all this, seeing, hearing, speaking, thinking, experiencing. Who am I? Don't bother about the object. Only bother about the subject. Think about, who am I? Turn this thought, turn this idea, turn this question over and over again in the mind. Who am I? So this is one kind of advice that we can get. But another authority may say, just give up all thought of the I. Just don't let it come into consideration at all. So long as you start saying, thinking, I, so long as you even are asking, who am I, then the trouble begins. So forget all about the I. He gives diametrically opposite advice. Another authority may say, well, realize the self, the great self. The self is all, the self is everything, the self is transcendental, the self is God. You are that. Just realize that self. But another authority, on the other hand, may say, realize the not-self. May say there's no self, no such thing, pure illusion, just words. So see that there's no self at all. That's the advice we get from that quarter. And somebody else, perhaps on a more psychological level, not quite such a lofty plane, may simply, well, be yourself. Develop your own personality. Do your own thing, as the current idiom has it. But somebody else again will say, no. Tear up the ego by the roots. Just get rid of it. Throw it away. Blow it up with dynamite if necessary. I remember some years ago I went to a lecture by a well-known Buddhist speaker, and he went into this at great length, in great detail, under the similitude of climbing the mountainside. I forget what else he said, but he describes the person climbing up the mountainside as, in the course of his progress, hacking off great bleeding lumps of self. So as to make himself apparently all the lighter for the journey, or the ascent. And presumably, he was to hack them off with a sort of spiritual razor blade. So in this way, we become confused. Who am I? Or don't think about it. Realize the self, there's no self. Develop your personality, get rid of your ego. Conflicting advice comes in this way from all quarters, from all directions. So naturally, we become confused. And we become confused about what is, after all, really a quite fundamental issue. We don't know what to think. We don't know who is right. We don't know who is speaking the truth. So we don't know what to do. We're just vaguely conscious that there's something, something about something sort of here to which we refer as I or me. We're pretty clear about that, at least most of the time, that there is something, call it what you like, here, or there. We're not quite sure about that, but anyway, it's somewhere, if not here or there, or somewhere in between, or somehow it covers both, and we call it I or we call it me. And it seems to us that this is the same something to which such terms as self and ego, etc., also apply, also refer. But we don't know quite what to do about it, this sort of experience of I or me, this so-called self, if it is that, or this ego or person. We don't know quite what to do about it in view of all these conflicting advices that we've been receiving. The experience of I, the experience of me, is undoubtedly there. Even if it ought not to be there, still it's there. Or we may say, even if it isn't really there at all, but we only think it is. But the thought is still there, even if it's a wrong thought. Well, sometimes we think, well, perhaps we only think that we think it is there. And in this way, of course, we really do get confused. But the practical question remains, well, what are we to do about this I? Or about the thought of this I? Whether it's about the I itself or the thought about the I, it comes to the same thing. Or even the thought of the I. What are we to do about that? Are we supposed to cultivate it? Or are we supposed to develop it? Or are we supposed to refine it? Or should we just look at it quietly and steadily until we see that it isn't really there at all? Or should we just quietly ignore it and hope that it would go away? What should we do? So obviously some clarification is urgently needed. We have to embark on our own great rectification of terms. On the rectification of terms, perhaps even more thoroughgoing than the one envisaged by Confucius. Because the matter is not just of theoretical interest, it's of great practical consequence, of great practical importance. Unless we settle this matter, settle this issue, then our spiritual life is more or less at a standstill. Because we don't know what to do about the self, or about individuality. Don't know whether to cultivate it or eradicate it, reject it or ignore it, idealize it or debunk it. Don't know whether what we're already doing in the way of spiritual practice, exercises and so on, is right or wrong. Don't know whether we are evolving, whether we're standing still, or whether even we're regressing. So this problem must be resolved. Now, first of all, let us look at the terms that we've been using. Terms apparently referring in one way or another to the I or to the me, including the term used in the title of this week's talk. So including that term, there are 4 such terms altogether. First of all, there's the term self. Then there's the term individual. Then there's the term ego. And then there's the term person. Each of these terms has a number of derivative forms. For instance, we say not only self, but we've got selfish, we've got unselfish, self-centered, self-realization. So in this way, there's quite a large family, as it were, of words, these 4 terms, on all their derivatives. Now, if we take these 4 terms, together with all their shades of meaning, all the ways in which they can be used, and all the derivative forms, we notice something which is quite interesting, something which is quite relevant to our present purpose, something that will help us to solve the problem of individuality true or false. We notice, if we examine them, that all these words, the four original words and their derivatives, all these words can be used in two different ways, or classified in two different groups, one positive and one negative. In other words, each of the four words has a double meaning, can be used in two different, even to opposed senses, one good and one bad. And it's for this reason that we can speak of true individuality and false individuality, of the lower self and the higher self, of a person and also of a personality, of being egocentric and of being ego-directed. Each of these, therefore, we may say, is to be both cultivated and eradicated depending on the sense in which the word is used, whether positive or negative. Now, at this point, a third question arises. And the question is, what is the basis of the distinction? That is, the distinction between the positive and the negative usages of the four words. And in order to answer this question, we must go back to last lecture, back to the question of alienated awareness. We saw that alienated awareness arose due to one's failure to experience oneself, especially to experience one's feelings and one's emotions, particularly negative feelings and negative emotions. Now, this failure tends to create in us a split. This is why it's so disastrous. It tends to create in us a split between that part of oneself which one continues to experience, or to allow oneself to experience, and that part of oneself which one no longer experiences, which one has ceased to experience, or at least which one experiences only intermittently and very imperfectly, very partially. Or we may say that the split is between the conscious and the unconscious. Now, because one refuses to experience a certain part of oneself, it does not follow that that part ceases to exist. It does not mean that that part is no longer alive, that it has, by our refusal to experience it, has been killed off, as it were. Whether we know it or not, that part is still very much alive. Not only alive, but kicking. It still makes its presence felt, even though it is not seen. Now, we all know that from time to time, we are subject to what we call moods, often rather negative moods. Sometimes we feel, say, depressed, or we feel angry, or we feel apprehensive. It just comes over us. It just takes possession of us, and we don't know why. We don't know where the mood comes from. We don't know its origin, its causation. And we say, or at least we think, when the mood is on us, or at least we say, or we think it afterwards, when the mood has passed away, we say that we are not, or that we were not ourselves. Because so long as the mood persists, and to the extent that the mood persists, we feel, for the time being, as though, almost, we were somebody else. Now, in many cases, these moods are due to the subterranean activity of unacknowledged parts, or if you like, aspects of ourselves. And from this follows an interesting and important conclusion. We've seen that when subject removes, we say, or we can say, that we are not ourselves, that for the time being we are, as it were, somebody else. Now, what does this mean? It means, if we reflect on it, that we are in fact not so much a self as a succession of selves. Or we may say, we are more like a bundle of selves, not just a self, the same self all the way through, but a bundle of selves, like a bundle of sticks, of which only one is usually operative at any one time. There isn't just one unified, completely integrated, continually operative self in us, as we tend to assume. We can even say that we're a collection of selves, each of which is battling for supremacy. And this explains why we so often fail to do things that we have decided to do. For instance, we decide to get up early in the morning. So we assume that the same self is operative all the time, all the way through. The self that makes the decision, the self that carries out the action, is one and the same. But in fact, it is not so. One self decides at night, before we go to get up early in the morning. Self has, as it were, come on duty. The old one is no longer there. And the new self, the self that's now vaguely, sort of being half aware that when we decide to do something but we're not doing it, we sort of vaguely wonder what has happened. We can now see good and the bad person and ego. Good refers to a higher degree, refers to a lower degree of unification and integration. A true individuality is a more integrated individuality. A false individuality is that which is less integrated. True individuality, therefore, is to be developed, and false is higher, self, etc. That is to be developed. And we integrate in the first place by recovering and acknowledging those parts of ourselves, those aspects of ourselves which we had disowned, by allowing ourselves to experience them once again. This is what we may term integration on the level. But we must also integrate with our own unrealized higher potentialities. This is, we may say, a sort of vertical integration. And this integration, both on the level, horizontal and vertical, with our higher possibilities, this integration leads to increase of awareness. That is, an increase of true awareness, increase of integrated awareness. And this leads to increase of self-consciousness. And in this way, we evolve. So the path is quite clear before us. We can see quite definitely what it is that we have to do. There's no need at this stage for us to concern ourselves with the reality or unreality of the individual in a metaphysical sense. We know that we are conscious, that we are aware. We are aware of ourselves. We have the rudiments of self-consciousness. And this is indubitably our experience. There's no need to inquire whether this experience is metaphysically real or unreal. Such an inquiry, we may say, at least at this stage, is meaningless. What we have to do is to clarify and intensify that experience, to increase awareness, to increase self-consciousness. And in this way, we shall cultivate individuality. What, if you like, shall pass from false individuality to true individuality. Now we've seen that the words individual, self, person, and ego are all used in good and in bad senses. Their meaning, in other words, is extremely fluid. But at the same time, there are standard modern psychological usages which try to fix the meanings of these terms to some extent. It may be useful for us to refer to these. After that, we'll conclude with a few remarks on the Buddha's teaching of anatta. In modern psychological usage, individuality means the sum total of the characteristics of an individual which distinguish him from other individuals. The sum total of the characteristics of an individual which distinguish him from other individuals. And these characteristics may be conscious or unconscious, or they may exist in varying degrees of unification and integration. Here, individuality is a purely descriptive term. Personality is defined as the integrated and dynamic organization of the physical, mental, and moral and social qualities of the individual, as that manifests to other people in the give and take of social life. And self is defined as the personality or ego regarded as an agent, conscious of his own continuing identity. Jung uses the word self in a sense of his own. Summarizing Jung's views on this subject, one of his followers, one of his disciples, writes, "The self, by definition, comprises the full scope of a personality, from its most individual traits to its most generic attitudes and experiences, actual as well as potential. Hence, it transcends the existing personality. The archetype of wholeness or of the self can therefore be regarded as the dominant of psychic growth." Finally, ego is defined as an individual's experience of himself, or the dynamic unity which is the individual. Now, it's possible for us to adapt these definitions to our own more specialized requirements. We can say that the word or the term individuality represents the present, relatively unintegrated state of experience of ourselves. Personality, we can say, is the process of that integration. Self is the future state of complete integration. And ego is one's consciousness of the whole process of development and of oneself as its agent. But what about the Buddha's teaching of anatta? someone may put this question. Did the Buddha not state categorically that there is no self? Many people, I'm sure, are under that impression. So let us, before we close, devote just a few minutes to this question. I remember that when I was in India many years ago, when I was studying Pali and Abhidhamma and Buddhist logic in Benares, one of my teachers there used to be very fond of pointing out that the word anatta, Sanskrit enhancement, is a compound word. It's made up of two parts. It's made up of the word atta or atma, usually translated as self, and it's made up of the negative prefix an, anatta, anatma. And this teacher used further to point out, and this was a point that he very much insisted on, he used to point out that if one wanted to understanding the meaning of anatma or anatta, non-self or no self, one could do so only after having understood the meaning of atta or atma. This might appear obvious, but it wasn't apparently obvious to everyone, not everybody that he had met anyway. In other words, you cannot understand what is meant by anatma or anatta unless you know what particular conception of the self it is which is being negated. It's clear from the contexts, the various contexts in which the word anatta or anatma occurs in the Buddhist scriptures that the Buddha was concerned to negate the contemporary idea, the contemporary Brahminical idea of a permanent, unchanging self. He was concerned to negate this idea. He did not teach that no self whatsoever exists. Did not teach that our experience of ourselves is a complete and utter delusion, that we aren't really here at all. We just think that we are, and that the thought itself is a delusion. He taught that the self, the empirical self, the psyche, does exist, but that it is constantly changing. And it's because it is changing that it can evolve, develop, grow. Therefore, we may say that the purpose of his teaching, the teaching of anatta, literally the no self or the not self, is not theoretical, but practical. The anatta teaching is not intended as a metaphysical statement. It's not intended as an assertion or denial of the existence or non-existence of the self in a metaphysical sense. The Buddha is not concerned with that. It's intended, we may say, as a safeguard to the possibility of treading the path. Because if there is in us any element which is fixed and unchanging and permanent, then no growth, no progress, no evolution is possible. So the Buddha pointed out that all that we experience as the self, all that we call the self, all that we know as the self, is in a state of constant flux and change. And this is what he means by anatta. So in this way, the teaching of anatta is intended as a safeguard to the possibility of treading the path, which means changing oneself in a forward, in an upward direction. The same holds good, we may say, of our own current distinction between individuality, true or false. This too is intended as a solution of a practical problem, intended to help us fulfill the process of the higher evolution of man, the higher evolution of the individual.